Remember when Thanksgiving dinner meant more than just turkey, stuffing, and green bean casserole? There was a time when every family had their own secret lineup of side dishes. The ones that made you reach for seconds before you even finish your firsts. Maybe it was Grandma's shimmering cranberry mold that wobbled when she carried it to the table. Or that mysterious casserole with the crackers on top that somehow tasted better than anything made from scratch today. These weren't just recipes. They were rituals. The dishes that showed up year after year, the ones you'd forget about by February but missed desperately by November. Today, we're counting down 25 forgotten Thanksgiving side dishes that once ruled holiday tables across America. From the practical to the peculiar, the coastal to the heartland. Which one deserves to make a comeback at your table this year? Let's find out, starting with number 1. Cream pearl onions. If you wanted to prove you were a serious cook in the 1950s and 60s, you made cream pearl onions. Not because they were complicated, though the prep work could make you cry more than any regular onion ever could, but because they showed you cared enough to spend an entire afternoon on a single side dish. Pearl onions are about the size of a marble, and each one needed to be peeled by hand. The trick was to blanch them first, drop them in boiling water for just a minute, then shock them in ice water. The skins would loosen up enough that you could pinch them off, but you still had to do it one by one. 30 onions minimum for a decent batch. Some grandmothers would sit at the kitchen table with a paring knife and a bowl, peeling onions while the parade played on the television in the next room. Once peeled, those little onions went into a gentle simmer. You couldn't boil them hard or they'd fall apart. You couldn't undercook them or they'd be too sharp. They needed to be tender enough to yield to a fork but still hold their shape. While they cooked, she'd make the sauce. Real butter, never margarine, melted in a saucepan. Flour whisked in to make a roux. Then milk, added slowly so it wouldn't clump, stirred constantly until it thickened into something silky and white. The secret ingredient was nutmeg. Just a few gratings, enough that you'd taste something warm and mysterious without quite being able to name it. White pepper instead of black, because black specks would ruin the pristine white sauce. The onions got folded in, coated completely, and the whole thing went into a serving dish. What you ended up with was a bowl of tiny, tender onions swimming in a sauce that tasted like winter comfort. They were mild, creamy, slightly sweet, and absolutely nothing like the harsh bite of a raw onion. Today, you'd be hard-pressed to find pearl onions fresh at most grocery stores, and even harder-pressed to find someone willing to peel them. But that's exactly what made them special. Molded cranberry salad. There was something almost ceremonial about the moment Grandma would bring out the molded cranberry salad. She'd carry it from the kitchen with both hands, this gleaming ruby red ring sitting on her good china platter, and set it down in the center of the table like she was presenting the crown jewels. And in a way, she was. The preparation always started the night before. A can of whole berry cranberry sauce, the kind with the actual berries you could see, got mixed with crushed pineapple that had been drained within an inch of its life. Nobody wanted a watery mold. Chopped pecans went in next, and if you were from certain parts of Texas, you might add a little orange zest. The mixture got poured into a ring mold, the kind with intricate patterns that would show up in reverse once it's set, and into the refrigerator it went. The next day came the flip. Some grandmothers had a whole technique involving warm towels and saying a little prayer. Others just gave it a good shake and hoped for the best. When it worked, and it didn't always work, you'd have this magnificent cranberry wreath sitting there, waiting for its final touch. That final touch was usually a mixture of softened cream cheese and whipped topping, sweetened just enough, spread over the top, and smoothed with a butter knife until it looked like frosted glass. Some families would pipe it on with a pastry bag if they were feeling fancy. Others would add a sprinkle of extra pecans or a few whole cranberries for garnish. When you sliced into it, you got this perfect cross-section. The tart cranberries, the sweet pineapple, the crunch of pecans, all held together in that wobbly, shimmering gel. It was sweet enough to almost be dessert, but it showed up right there on your dinner plate, next to the turkey and the gravy. Nobody questioned it. That's just how Thanksgiving was. Cornbread dressing with giblet gravy. In the South, there was stuffing, and then there was dressing. And if your grandmother made it right, the difference was everything. Real cornbread dressing started the day before Thanksgiving, when she'd bake a skillet of cornbread and leave it sitting out overnight. Not because she forgot about it, but because day-old cornbread crumbled better, soaked up more flavor, and held together without turning to mush. The morning of Thanksgiving, she'd crumble that cornbread by hand while a stock pot simmered on the back burner. Inside that pot was the turkey neck, the heart, the gizzard, all those parts that come wrapped in paper inside the bird that most people throw away now without a second thought. She'd simmer them for hours until the kitchen smelled like something between comfort and anticipation. The dressing itself was simple. Crumbled cornbread, sautéed celery and onions, turkey broth ladled in until everything was just moist enough. Some grandmothers added sage. Others swore by poultry seasoning. A few rebel cooks down in Louisiana would slip in some andouille sausage when nobody was watching. Into the oven it went, and out it came with edges so crispy they'd crackle under your fork. But the giblet gravy, that's what made grown men go quiet at the dinner table. Those simmered giblets got chopped fine and stirred into a roux with pan drippings and stock. The result was a gravy so rich and deeply flavored that store-bought turkey gravy tastes like dishwater by comparison. You'd pour it over everything on your plate, let it seep into the dressing, pool around the turkey, and if there was any left, you'd sop it up with a dinner roll. Today, most folks buy their turkeys without giblets, and box stuffing mix sits on every grocery store shelf. But for anyone who grew up with this dish, nothing else tastes quite like home. Scalloped oysters. On the coasts, Thanksgiving meant oysters. Not for everyone, mind you. Some family members would eye the dish suspiciously and stick to their sweet potatoes. But for those who grew up with it, Thanksgiving without scalloped oysters was like Thanksgiving without pie. The recipe came from a time when oysters were cheap and plentiful, when every church cookbook from Maryland to Massachusetts had at least 2 versions, and when even inland families could get them canned if they couldn't get them fresh. A pint of fresh oysters was the goal, plump and briny, still smelling like the ocean. You'd spread them in a buttered baking dish, those oysters nestled together like they were trying to stay warm. Over the top went cream, rich and thick, mixed with a splash of sherry if grandma kept it in the house, or sometimes just a little of the oyster liquor for extra brine. Saltine crackers or breadcrumbs came next, crushed up and tossed with melted butter until every crumb was coated. Some families used Ritz crackers for a sweeter, richer top. Others swore by plain breadcrumbs. The debate could get heated. Into the oven it went, hot enough that the cream would bubble up around the edges and the cracker topping would turn the color of autumn leaves. 20 minutes later, you'd have something that looked modest but tasted like the sea had come to dinner. The oysters stayed tender. The cream turned into a savory custard, and that buttery cracker crust gave you something to crunch through before you hit the soft, briny center. Inland, this dish never quite caught on the same way. Fresh oysters were expensive and hard to come by, and canned oysters, well, they just weren't the same. By the 1970s, even on the coasts, scalloped oysters started disappearing from tables. Tastes changed. Seafood before turkey started to seem odd. But for those who remember, there's nothing quite like that first bite, the one that tastes like tradition and salt air. Carrot raisin salad with pineapple and mayonnaise. This was the salad that confused every kid at the Thanksgiving table. It looked like it should be dessert. It was sweet, it was colorful, it had pineapple and raisins for crying out loud. But there it sat, right next to the turkey, and Grandma called it salad, so a salad it must be. The recipe took about 5 minutes from start to finish, which made it perfect for potlucks and church suppers where you needed to bring something quick but impressive looking. Carrots got shredded on a box grater, the medium holes that left them thin enough to be tender but thick enough to have some bite. Raisins went in, the plump golden ones if you could find them. The regular dark raisins worked fine. A can of crushed pineapple, drained but not too thoroughly because you want a little juice for moisture. Then came a mayonnaise. Not a little, a lot. Enough that every shred of carrot got coated. Enough that the whole thing turned creamy and held together. Some grandmothers would add a squeeze of lemon juice or a spoonful of sugar to balance it out. Others would throw in some shredded coconut or a handful of chopped walnuts if they were feeling fancy. Into the refrigerator it went to chill, and by dinner time, The flavors had melded into something that was somehow both refreshing and rich. The carrot stayed crisp, the raisins plumped up from the pineapple juice, and that mayonnaise tied everything together into a salad that was sweet, creamy, a little tangy, and completely unlike anything you'd find at a salad bar today. By the 1980s, lighter salads with vinaigrettes started taking over. Mayonnaise-based salads fell out of fashion, dismissed as too heavy, too retro, too much like something your mother made. But for a solid 30 years, this was the taste of celebration, proof that not every salad needed lettuce to be worth making. Ambrosia Salad. Ambrosia Salad was named after the food of the gods. And while that might have been overselling it just a little, there was something almost magical about how a few cans from the pantry could turn into something that felt special. This wasn't cooking exactly. This was assembly, and assembly could be done in under 5 minutes, which made it perfect for busy Thanksgiving mornings when the oven was already packed and the stovetop was a battlefield. The base was usually a large kind of fruit cocktail, those little cubes of peaches and pears and grapes, and that one mystery red cherry that everyone fought over. Some families preferred mandarin oranges, the kind that came in light syrup and separated into perfect little segments. Either way, the fruit got drained thoroughly. Nobody wanted a watery salad. Then came the mix-ins. Shredded coconut, the sweetened kind that came in a bag and smelled like vacation. Miniature marshmallows, because if a dish could be improved with marshmallows, why wouldn't you? Maraschino cherries, chopped up so their bright red color bled just a little into everything else. Some families added chopped pecans or walnuts for crunch. Others threw in a can of pineapple tidbits. The binder was either sour cream or whipped topping, depending on which camp your grandmother belonged to. Sour cream gave it a tangy richness that balanced out all that sweetness. Whipped topping made it fluffy and light, almost like dessert. The whole thing got folded together gently, then covered and put in the refrigerator to chill while the turkey roasted. By dinner time, the flavors had mingled. The coconut had softened, the marshmallows had started to dissolve just a tiny bit around the edges, and everything had taken on a uniform, creamy coating. It landed on plates right next to the turkey and stuffing, and nobody questioned it. That's just where it belonged. Sweet, cool, creamy, and completely unlike anything else on the table. Some people used it as a palate cleanser between bites of gravy and cranberry sauce. Others just ate it straight, like the dessert it secretly was. Oyster dressing. While most of America was stuffing their turkeys with bread and herbs, families along the Atlantic and Gulf Coast knew better. They knew that oysters and Thanksgiving belonged together, that the brine of the sea and the richness of turkey created something that no amount of sage and onions could match. Oyster dressing started with good bread, nothing fancy, just white sandwich bread or day-old rolls, cubed up and left to dry out a little. The oysters, fresh from the market if you were lucky, came next. You drain them, save the liquor, and chop them rough. Not too fine, or they disappear into the bread. Not too chunky, or you get a mouthful of oyster and nothing else. In a skillet, butter melted and celery and onions sweated down until they turned soft and sweet. Some families added green bell pepper for a little sharpness. Others threw in a handful of fresh parsley. The bread cubes went into a big bowl, the vegetables got mixed in, and then came the oysters distributed evenly so every serving would have some. The liquid was the key. Turkey stock made from the neck and giblets, mixed with that reserved oyster liquor, poured over everything until it was moist but not soggy. There was an art to it. Too dry, and it would come out like Thanksgiving sawdust. Too wet, and you'd have oyster soup. Some grandmothers could eyeball it. Others measured carefully, a quarter cup at a time. It could be baked inside the turkey, which was traditional, or in its own casserole, which was practical and gave you those crispy edges everyone fought over. Either way, the oysters melted into the bread, lending their mineral, briny flavor to every bite. It was rich without being heavy, seafood without being fishy, and absolutely nothing like the stove-top stuffing that would eventually push it off most tables. Inland families rarely made it. Oysters were expensive when they could be found at all, and the idea of mixing seafood with turkey seemed strange to people who'd never lived near the ocean. But along the coasts, it was tradition. And for those who grew up with it, Thanksgiving without oyster dressing wasn't really Thanksgiving at all. Lime Jell-O salad with cottage cheese. Of all the Jell-O salads that graced mid-century Thanksgiving tables, and there were many, lime Jell-O with cottage cheese was probably the most polarizing. People either loved it with a devotion usually reserved for religion and sports teams, or they recoiled at the very idea, unable to understand why anyone would suspend dairy products and flavored gelatin. The recipe came straight from the back of the Jell-O box and from countless women's magazine spreads featuring smiling housewives and pearls. A box of lime Jell-O got dissolved in boiling water, then cooled just enough that it wouldn't cook the other ingredients but was still liquid enough to pour. Canned pineapple tidbits went in, drained carefully. A generous scoop of cottage cheese, the small curd kind that distributed better through the gel. Sometimes chopped celery for crunch, sometimes chopped walnuts, sometimes both. The ambitious cooks would make it in layers. One layer of plain gelatin on the bottom, then a layer with the cottage cheese and fruit, then another clear layer on top. This required patience and perfect timing, because each layer had to set before you added the next, and the refrigerator was already crowded with everything else for Thanksgiving. Once fully set and unmolded onto a platter, it was something to behold. Bright artificial green, studded with bits of white cottage cheese and yellow pineapple, wobbling slightly when you move the table. Some families would garnish it with a dollop of mayonnaise, which seems insane now, but made perfect sense in 1965. Others would add a lettuce leaf underneath for color contrast. The taste was exactly what you'd expect, and also somehow surprising. Sweet lime flavor, creamy cottage cheese, the slight acidity of pineapple, all in a texture that was somehow both firm and wobbly. It was cold, refreshing, completely bizarre, and absolutely sincere in its weirdness. Nobody was trying to be ironic. This was genuinely considered elegant. By the 1980s, Jell-O salads started disappearing from holiday tables, dismissed as too retro or too weird. But for one glorious generation, they were the height of modern cooking. And lime Jell-O with cottage cheese was the flagship dish that either proved you understood mid-century cuisine or proved you absolutely did not. Baked corn pudding. Corn pudding was the dish that nobody remembered to talk about, but everyone remembered to eat. It sat there quietly in the middle of the table, not as flashy as the candied yams, not as essential as the mashed potatoes, but by the end of the meal, the casserole dish would be scraped clean. The base was always corn, two kinds if you were doing it right. A can of cream corn for the pudding texture, thick and sweet. A can of whole kernel corn for little bursts of actual corn flavor. Something to bite down on. Eggs went in next, beaten until they were frothy, and they're what turned this from corn soup into something that's set up like a custard. Milk or cream, depending on how rich Grandma was feeling, and melted butter that pooled on top in little golden circles before you stirred it in. The secret ingredient that nobody talked about was sugar. Just a tablespoon or two, nothing that would make it taste like dessert, but enough to bring out the natural sweetness of the corn and balance the eggs. Some recipes called for a handful of flour or cornmeal to help it set. Others left it loose and spoonable, more like a savory flan than a solid casserole. Into a buttered baking dish it went, and into the oven low and slow. You wanted the edges to puff up and brown, almost like a soufflé, while the center stayed soft and custardy. The smell that filled the kitchen was somewhere between cornbread and creme brulee, sweet and savory all at once. When you scooped it onto your plate, it jiggled just a little like it wasn't quite sure if it was a side dish or a dessert. Kids loved it because it tasted almost like candy. Adults loved it because it reminded them of being kids. And everyone agreed that a Thanksgiving table without corn pudding felt like something was missing, even if they couldn't quite put their finger on what. Irish mashed potatoes, Colcannon. In neighborhoods where the Irish heritage ran strong, Thanksgiving tables often included a bowl of something that looked like regular mashed potatoes, but was so much more. Colcannon, though most families just called it Grandma's mashed potatoes, and if you asked what was in them, you'd get a little smile and maybe a wink. The secret was cabbage, or kale, depending on which county in Ireland your family came from and how seriously they took those old regional differences. The greens got shredded fine and sautéed in butter until they softened and sweetened, losing any harsh bite and turning into something mellow and rich. Some grandmothers used green cabbage for a milder flavor. Others preferred Savoy cabbage for its tender leaves. And a few rebels used kale, which turned the whole dish a deeper green and added an earthy note. The potatoes themselves were standard Irish. Russets or Yukon Golds, boiled until they fell apart when you poked them with a fork, then mashed with more butter than should legally be allowed and enough milk or cream to make them fluffy. Salt and white pepper to season. And then, at the very end, those sautéed greens got folded in, leaving ribbons of dark green throughout the pale potatoes. What you ended up with was something that looked interesting enough to ask about, but familiar enough that even picky eaters would try it. The cabbage or kale added a subtle sweetness and a slight mineral quality that made the potatoes taste more complex, more interesting, more like a dish with a story behind it. In Boston, in Chicago, in Philadelphia, anywhere Irish immigrants had settled and raised families, this dish appeared on Thanksgiving tables as a quiet reminder of where the family came from. It wasn't showy, it didn't require explanation, but it connected every bite to something older than America itself. And that made it more than just a side dish. It made it heritage. Cranberry Rings from a can. Let's be honest, the canned cranberry sauce was never trying to compete with homemade. It was in a category all its own, wobbling on plates with those distinctive ridges that marked it as absolutely, proudly, defiantly from a can. And for millions of American families, that was exactly the point. The ritual started with the can opener. That satisfying crunch of the blade piercing the tin, the careful turn around the edge, and then the moment of truth. Some people opened both ends and pushed the sauce through like a tube. Others opened just one end and let it slide out slowly, making gentle wet sounds that were somehow both disgusting and deeply satisfying. Once it emerged onto the serving plate, there it sat. A perfect cylinder of jellied cranberry, glistening in garnet red, with those horizontal grooves running around it like growth rings on a tree. The grooves weren't just decorative. They were nature's own, or rather, Ocean Spray's own, built-in portion guides. Each ring was roughly one serving, though nobody paid attention to that, because who eats just one slice of cranberry sauce? Some families served it jellied, which had a smooth, almost artificially perfect texture that squeaked against your teeth. Others went for whole berry, which had actual cranberry pieces suspended in the gel and felt slightly more homemade, even though it came from the same aisle. The taste was sweet, tart, and utterly consistent. Every can tasted exactly like every other can, which was either comforting or boring, depending on your point of view. Grandmothers who prided themselves on making everything from scratch would sometimes hide the can at the bottom of the trash, not wanting anyone to know they'd taken a shortcut. But their grandkids knew. Everyone knew. And nobody cared because that wobbling cylinder of cranberry sauce was as much a part of Thanksgiving as the turkey itself. Maybe more, actually, since turkey could be dry, but cranberry sauce was reliably, perfectly, exactly what you expected every single time. Rutabaga Mash. In farmhouses across the upper Midwest, where winter came hard and staying power mattered more than novelty, the Thanksgiving table often included a bowl of something that city folks and coastal relatives would eye suspiciously. Rutabaga mash, yellowish gold, and earthy, sat there like a challenge. Try me, it seemed to say. I dare you. Rutabagas are not pretty vegetables. They're knobby, they're huge, they're covered in a waxy coating, and they require a sharp knife and some genuine muscle to break down. But in November, when they came fresh from the root cellar or the farm stand, they were exactly what Thanksgiving needed. Something substantial, something that would stick to your ribs, something that tasted like the earth itself. The preparation was straightforward but physical. Peel away that thick skin, revealing the golden flesh underneath. Cut it into chunks, which took some real elbow grease because rutabagas were dense. Drop those chunks into boiling water and cook them until they were tender enough to mash, which could take a good half hour. They weren't like potatoes, which went soft quickly. Rutabagas took their time. Once they were tender, the water got drained off and the mashing began. A potato masher worked fine, though some grandmothers preferred a ricer for a smoother texture. Butter went in, plenty of it, and cream if there was extra from the morning's milking. Salt and pepper, and sometimes a tiny pinch of sugar to balance out the Rutabaga's natural slight bitterness. What you ended up with was something that tasted like Thanksgiving distilled. Earthy, rich, slightly sweet, and deeply satisfying. It was a palate cleanser between the sweet potato casserole and the rich turkey gravy, something that tasted grown up and serious. Kids rarely love it on first try, but they grow into it the same way they grow into coffee and dark chocolate. Today, most grocery stores don't even stock fresh rutabagas outside of rural areas. And when they do, shoppers walk right past them looking for something easier. But that's exactly why Rutabaga Mash mattered. It was the side dish that separated the serious cooks from the casual ones. The dish that said we remember where we came from, even if where we came from was hard. Glazed carrots with brown sugar and butter. If there was a side dish that never caused an argument, never sparked a family debate, and always disappeared from the serving bowl, it was glazed carrots. They weren't fancy, they weren't complicated, and they didn't require any special technique passed down through generations. They were just good. The carrots themselves started simple. Fresh ones, peeled and sliced into coins or cut into sticks, depending on your preference. Some grandmothers liked them thick, almost like little logs. Others cut them thin, so they'd cook faster and glaze better. Baby carrots weren't really a thing yet, or if they were, they weren't in most grocery stores, so you did the work yourself. They went into boiling water, salted generously, and cooked just until tender. Not soft, not mushy, but tender enough that a fork would slide through without resistance. Overcooked carrots turned to mush and ruined the whole dish. Undercooked carrots stayed hard and wouldn't hold the glaze. There was a sweet spot, usually around 8 to 10 minutes, where they were perfect. While they drained, a skillet warmed on the stove. Butter went in, a lot of butter, more than seemed necessary, but exactly as much as was needed. Once it melted and started to foam, brown sugar got sprinkled in. Not white sugar, which was too clean and sharp, but brown sugar with its molasses notes and caramel undertones. It dissolved into the butter, bubbling up into a glossy syrup that smelled like autumn itself. The carrots went into the pan and got tossed gently until every piece was coated in that sweet, buttery glaze. They'd shimmer under the kitchen lights, practically glowing. Some grandmothers would add a pinch of cinnamon or a few gratings of fresh ginger. Others kept it pure and simple. Either way, by the time they hit the table, they were little bites of caramelized heaven. Kids who claimed to hate vegetables would eat these. Teenagers who refused everything their parents made would help themselves to seconds. And even the adults, who were supposed to be setting good examples by eating their plain green beans, would sneak an extra carrot or two. They were that good. Simple, honest, and absolutely perfect. Broccoli rice casserole with cheese whiz. If there was a side dish that perfectly captured the optimism and sheer audacity of convenience food in its golden age, it was broccoli rice casserole made with cheese whiz. Not shredded cheddar, not even Velveeta. Cheese whiz, straight from the jar, that fluorescent orange substance that could barely be called cheese, but somehow made everything it touched taste like childhood. The recipe was almost aggressively simple. Frozen broccoli, the chopped kind that came in a bag, no need to thaw it first. A couple cups of cooked white rice, which could be leftovers from Chinese takeout, for all anyone cared. A jar of cheese whiz, or sometimes 2 jars if you wanted it extra cheesy, which you did because that was the entire point. Mix it all together in a casserole dish and pop in the oven. What came out 30 minutes later was a bubbling, neon orange mass of vegetables, starch, and processed cheese food. The broccoli lost any pretense of being a healthy vegetable. The rice became just a vehicle for cheese delivery. And the cheese whiz, which had melted and spread throughout every inch of the casserole, coated everything in a glossy, salty, vaguely dairy-like sauce that absolutely nobody could resist. This was not gourmet cooking. This was not farm-to-table. This was not even particularly good for you. But it was reliable, it was crowd-pleasing, and it could be assembled by someone who'd had exactly 2 glasses of wine and was panicking because relatives would arrive in an hour. Kids loved it because it didn't taste like vegetables. Adults loved it because it took 10 minutes to prep and always turned out the same. And everyone agreed that while nobody would admit it was their favorite dish, the casserole dish was always empty by the end of the night. These days, with cheese was reformulated and fresh vegetables back in fashion. The original casserole is mostly a memory. But for anyone who grew up in the 1970s, that particular shade of orange and that particular salty, creamy flavor meant Thanksgiving was here. Jellied Waldorf salad. The classic Waldorf salad, crisp apples and celery with walnuts, and a creamy mayonnaise dressing, was already a staple at fancy hotel restaurants and upscale dinner parties. But someone somewhere in the 1950s looked at that perfectly good salad and thought, you know what this needs? Gelatin. And thus, the Jellied Waldorf salad was born. The preparation started with the fruit. Apples, usually red delicious because that's what everyone bought, got diced small. Celery, chopped fine. Walnuts, toasted if you were doing it right. Sometimes have grapes or even maraschino cherries for color. All of this got folded into partially set gelatin, either lemon or orange flavored, depending on your preference and what you had in the pantry. The timing was crucial. Add the fruit too early and it would sink to the bottom. Too late and the gelatin would be too firm to mix properly. You wanted that moment where the gelatin was just starting to thicken, getting syrupy, and the fruit could be suspended evenly throughout. Once mixed, it went into a clear glass mold, so you could admire your handiwork, layers of fruit suspended like insects in amber. After hours of chilling, the unmolding was always a tense moment. A quick dip of the mold in warm water to loosen the edges, then the flip onto a serving platter. If you did it right, it would slide out with a satisfying slurp, revealing its glossy exterior and the fruit trapped beautifully inside. If you did it wrong, well, you had a broken mess and a backup story about how deconstructed was actually very modern. When you sliced into it, the gelatin was firm enough to hold its shape but gave way easily to a fork. Each bite delivered crisp apple, crunchy celery, the slight bitterness of walnuts, all coated in sweet, slightly tangy gelatin. It was refreshing, it was unusual, and it was absolutely a product of its time. Today, the idea of putting Waldorf salad into Jell-O seems somewhere between quirky and unhinged. But for a generation of home cooks, it represented creativity, modern convenience, and the kind of ambition that made Thanksgiving dinner feel like an event. Sweet potato soufflé with marshmallow topping. No single dish sparked more Thanksgiving arguments than sweet potato soufflé with marshmallow topping. Family members divided into camps as firmly as any political debate. Team Marshmallow insisted the pillowy topping was essential, a sweet crown that made the dish festive and fun. Team No Marshmallow argued it was an abomination, too sweet, too childish, a distraction from the natural flavor of the sweet potatoes. The base of the dish was straightforward enough. Sweet potatoes, baked until soft, then peeled and mashed smooth. Butter, brown sugar, eggs, and vanilla went in, along with a splash of cream or milk to make everything light and fluffy. Some recipes called for pumpkin pie spice or just cinnamon and nutmeg. Others kept it simple and let the sweet potatoes speak for themselves. This soufflé, part of the name, was generous. Real soufflés required separated eggs, careful folding, and precise timing. This was more of a sweet potato casserole that puffed up a little in the oven thanks to the beaten eggs. But calling it a soufflé made it sound fancy, sophisticated, like something you'd order at a French restaurant rather than assemble from a recipe on the back of a sweet potato crate. Once the mixture was smooth and well combined, it went into a butter casserole dish. And then came the moment of truth. Team Marshmallow would blanket the entire surface with miniature marshmallows, arranged in careful rows or just dumped on top, depending on how much time they had. Some would even create patterns, spirals, or concentric circles of white and pink marshmallows if someone had brought the colored ones. Team No Marshmallow would stop there, or they'd add a pecan streusel topping instead. Butter, brown sugar, flour, and chopped pecans mixed together into crumbles and scattered over the top. When baked, it would turn crunchy and caramelized, adding texture without overwhelming sweetness. Into the oven, both versions went. The marshmallow top version came out looking like something from a children's birthday party. The marshmallows puffed up and golden brown, some of them charred at the edges where they'd been under the broiler at the last minute. The pecan top version looked more refined, more adult, more like something you'd find in a magazine spread. The taste difference was stark. Marshmallow version was unabashedly sweet, the marshmallows adding a fluffy, sugary layer that made every bite feel indulgent. The pecan version let the sweet potatoes shine, the nuts adding a bitter note that balanced the natural sweetness and made the dish feel more sophisticated. Arguments would break out every year. Grandchildren would insist on marshmallows because that's what Thanksgiving was supposed to taste like. Adult children would roll their eyes and suggest maybe this year we could try something different. Grandma would usually make two versions, one for each camp, and everyone would secretly try both and pretend they only liked one. The marshmallow controversy endures to this day. Some families have made peace with it, accepting that different tastes can coexist at the same table. Others are still fighting the good fight, insisting their version is the only correct one. But everyone agrees on one thing. Sweet potato soufflé, whatever you put on top of it, isn't optional. It's Thanksgiving. Squash casserole with Ritz cracker topping. Yellow squash never got the respect it deserved. It wasn't as sweet as butternut, as dramatic as acorn, or as trendy as spaghetti squash. It was just there, mild and unassuming, the middle child of the squash family. Until someone topped it with crushed Ritz crackers and butter, and suddenly, it became Thanksgiving royalty. The squash itself got sliced into rounds, not too thin or they'd turn to mush, not too thick or they'd never cook through. They went into a pot of boiling water for just a few minutes, enough to soften them, but not enough to make them fall apart. Some grandmothers would saute onions until they were sweet and golden, then mix them with the squash. Others would add shredded carrots for color and a little sweetness. The binding came from sour cream or sometimes mayonnaise, which sounds wrong, but somehow worked perfectly, turning the vegetables into something creamy without being heavy. An egg or two helped everything hold together. Salt, pepper, and that was about it for seasonings. The squash was the star, and everything else was just there to support it. But the real magic happened on top. A sleeve of Ritz crackers, crushed by hand or rolled under a rolling pin until they were somewhere between crumbs and chunks. Melted butter, poured over until every crumb glistened. Some cooks would add a sprinkle of paprika for color. Others would mix in a little grated Parmesan for extra richness. Into the oven it went, and 20 minutes later, you had something beautiful. The top layer had turned golden brown and crispy, crackling when you broke through it with a spoon. Underneath, the squash was soft and creamy. The flavors melded together into something that tasted like summer vegetables and fall comfort all at once. The genius of the Ritz cracker topping was how it turned something healthy into something indulgent. The crackers were salty and buttery and added that satisfying crunch that made you forget you were eating vegetables. Kids who refused to touch squash any other way would clean their plates. And adults appreciated how the mild squash and the rich topping balanced each other perfectly. These days, cracker-top casseroles have mostly disappeared, replaced by vegetable dishes that let the vegetables shine on their own. But there was something honest about squash casserole with its buttery cracker crown. It didn't pretend to be health food. It just promised to taste good, and it always delivered. Brussels sprouts with chestnuts and bacon. There was a time, brief but glorious, when Brussels sprouts with chestnuts and bacon represented the height of continental sophistication at the American Thanksgiving table. This wasn't church potluck food. This was the dish you made when you wanted people to know you'd been reading Gourmet magazine. The Brussels sprouts themselves were fresh, back when you had to buy them on the stalk and cut them off yourself. Small ones were better, sweeter, and more tender than the huge ones that tasted like cabbage and regret. They got trimmed, halved, and usually blanched quickly in boiling water before being shocked in ice water to keep their bright green color. This was French technique showing up in American kitchens, and it made all the difference. Bacon was the easy part. Thick cut, chopped into pieces, rendered in a skillet until the fat ran clear and the meat turned crispy. Most of the fat got poured off, but enough stayed behind to cook everything else. Into that bacon fat went the Brussels sprouts, cut side down, where they'd get a golden crust that added a nutty, caramelized flavor. Then came the chestnuts, and here's where things got complicated. Fresh chestnuts required roasting, peeling, and chopping, a process that could take an hour and test the patience of even the most dedicated cook. After the American chestnut blight wiped out native trees, chestnuts became expensive imported luxuries, the kind of ingredient you'd find at specialty stores in cities, but nowhere else. Some grandmothers used canned chestnuts, which were easier but never quite as good. They lacked that sweet, buttery quality that fresh chestnuts had, though they were better than nothing. Once the chestnuts were in, everything got tossed together. The bacon added smoke and salt. The Brussels sprouts added earthy bitterness that turned sweet when caramelized, and the chestnuts added a gentle sweetness and a meaty texture that made the whole dish feel substantial. For a while, this was aspirational cooking. This was the dish that said you'd traveled, or at least read about travel. But as chestnuts became harder to find and Brussels sprouts fell out of favor, victims of too many overcooked, sulfurous school cafeteria versions, the dish faded away. Today, Brussels sprouts are trendy again, but usually roasted plain or with balsamic vinegar. The classic combination with chestnuts and bacon lives mainly in old cookbooks and the memories of those who tasted it when it was the height of sophistication. Baked apples with brown sugar and cinnamon. Long before there was apple pie, before there were apple turnovers or apple crisp, or any of the other fancy ways to dress up the harvest, there were just baked apples. Simple, honest, and so deeply connected to autumn that eating one in any other season would feel wrong. The apples were usually whatever the local orchard had in abundance. Rome Beauty apples were popular because they held their shape when baked. Jonagolds worked well too, and Granny Smith's if you liked a little tartness to cut through the sweetness. Each apple got cored from the top, not all the way through, leaving the bottom intact so it could hold the filling. The filling was where grandmothers got creative within a very narrow range. Brown sugar was essential, packed into the hollow center until it mounded slightly. A pat of butter went on top, because butter made everything better. Cinnamon, generous with it. The cheap stuff from the grocery store that came in a big container and tasted like childhood. Some grandmothers would add raisins or chopped walnuts. Others would use a little maple syrup instead of brown sugar. A few would splash in some apple cider or even a bit of bourbon if they were feeling festive. The apples sat in a baking dish with just enough water or cider in the bottom to create steam and prevent sticking. Into the oven they went, and for the next hour, the house would smell like everything good about fall. The apples would soften and slump slightly, their skins wrinkled and starting to split. The filling would melt and bubble, caramelizing at the edges and creating a sticky, spiced syrup that pooled at the bottom of each apple. Served warm, often with a scoop of vanilla ice cream or a pour of heavy cream. Baked apples were the kind of dessert that didn't feel like dessert. They felt wholesome, like something your great-grandmother's great-grandmother might have made. They landed on the table somewhere between the main course and the pie, a palate cleanser, a small sweet moment before the real sugar rush began. The beauty of baked apples was their flexibility. They could be a side dish with dinner, served alongside turkey and stuffing. They could be dessert, especially for people who found pie too fussy or too sweet. They could even be breakfast the next morning, cold from the refrigerator, the filling turned thick and jammy overnight. Today, with so many elaborate apple desserts competing for attention, simple baked apples have mostly faded away. They're too plain, too old-fashioned, too reminiscent of a time when dessert meant fruit and sugar and not much else. But for anyone who remembers biting into a soft, warm apple and hitting that pocket of melted brown sugar and cinnamon, nothing else tastes quite like home. Spoon bread. Spoon bread was the dish that separated confident Southern cooks from everyone else. It required timing, technique, and a willingness to serve something that could collapse into a sad puddle if you hesitated even a moment too long. When it worked, and it didn't always work, it was pure magic. The base was cornmeal, cooked with milk and butter into something thick and porridge-like. This wasn't the quick dumping of ingredients into a bowl. This was a process. You had to stand at the stove, stirring constantly, watching the cornmeal hydrate and thicken, making sure nothing scorched on the bottom of the pan. Once it reached the right consistency, thick enough to hold a spoon upright, you'd pull it off the heat and let it cool slightly. Here's where the technique mattered. Egg yolks got beaten into the warm cornmeal mixture, adding richness and helping everything bind together. But if the mixture was too hot, you'd end up with scrambled eggs and cornmeal mush. Too cool, and the eggs wouldn't incorporate properly. You had to feel it, know it, trust your instincts. The egg whites got whipped separately into soft peaks, not stiff, not floppy, but somewhere in between where they held their shape, but still had some give. Then came the folding. This was the moment that determined success or failure. You had to fold those whites into the cornmeal mixture gently enough that you didn't deflate them completely, but thoroughly enough that you didn't have streaks of white and yellow. Into a buttered baking dish it went, and into a hot oven. For about 30 minutes, it would puff up beautifully, rising like a soufflé, the top turning golden brown. And then came the race. From oven to table as fast as humanly possible, because spoon bread waits for no one. As it cooled, it would start to deflate, settling back into itself. Still delicious, but no longer that dramatic puff of cloud-like cornbread. The taste was somewhere between cornbread and custard, slightly sweet, deeply corny, with a texture that was both creamy and airy. You served it with a big spoon, hence the name, scooping it onto plates where it would puddle slightly and soak up any gravy nearby. It was Southern cooking at its most impressive, a dish that showed you knew what you were doing and weren't afraid of a little challenge. These days, spoon bread is rare even in the South. It requires too much attention in a world where most Thanksgiving side dishes can be prepped ahead and reheated. But for those who remember watching Grandma fold those egg whites just so, who remember that first bite of something impossibly light and rich at the same time, nothing else quite compares. Creamed spinach with nutmeg. Creamed spinach was restaurant food that somehow found its way home for Thanksgiving, bringing with it a touch of steakhouse elegance to the family table. This wasn't the frozen brick of spinach in white sauce that came in a box. This was the real deal, made from scratch, rich enough to be decadent, but still letting the spinach shine through. Fresh spinach was the goal, bunches of it from the market, sandy and dark green, and full of flavor. Washing it took forever because sand hid in every leaf, but it was worth it. The spinach would go into a hot pan with just the water clinging to its leaves, wilting down dramatically from a mountain to a handful in a matter of minutes. Once cooked, it got chopped fine and squeezed dry, and this was important. Any excess water would make the cream sauce thin and sad. The sauce was classic bechamel, butter and flour whisked together into a roux, then milk added slowly while stirring constantly. The goal was a sauce thick enough to coat the back of a spoon, creamy and smooth with no lumps. Some grandmothers used heavy cream instead of milk for extra richness. Others stuck with milk and added a little cream cheese at the end for body and tang. The secret ingredient, the thing that made people ask, "What's in this?" was nutmeg. Just a few gratings from a whole nutmeg, fresh and aromatic, not the pre-ground stuff that had been sitting in the spice cabinet since last Thanksgiving. Nutmeg and spinach had an affinity for each other, the warm spice cutting through the mineral earthiness of the greens and adding a layer of complexity that elevated the whole dish. Once the spinach was folded into the sauce and seasoned with salt and white pepper, it went into a serving dish or sometimes back into the oven for a few minutes to warm through and develop a slight skin on top. What you ended up with was something that tasted expensive and carefully prepared, something that made frozen spinach souffle look like the imposter it was. Kids often hated it because it was green and creamy and suspicious. But adults appreciated it, especially those who remembered ordering it at fancy restaurants and feeling sophisticated. And every so often, a kid would try it, surprised to discover that spinach could taste like something other than punishment. These days, creamed spinach has mostly disappeared from home Thanksgiving tables. It's still on steakhouse menus, still being ordered by businessmen on expense accounts, but it's rare to see someone make it from scratch for a holiday meal. Too much work, too rich, too old-fashioned. But for a generation, it represented bringing a little restaurant glamour home. Proof that you could cook fancy even if you weren't fancy yourself. Baked macaroni and tomatoes. Before mac and cheese became the default pasta side dish, before it appeared in every grocery store deli and on every chain restaurant kids menu, there was baked macaroni and tomatoes. It was simpler, lighter, and in its own way, more satisfying than its cheese-heavy cousin. The recipe came from a time when pasta was still slightly exotic, when Italian food meant spaghetti and maybe ravioli, but not much else. Elbow macaroni, the reliable standby, got boiled until tender, but not mushy. While it cooked, canned tomatoes, usually the stewed kind with bits of celery and onion already mixed in, warmed on the stove with a little butter and sugar to cut the acidity. Some grandmothers would add fresh onions, chopped fine and sautéed until sweet. Others would throw in some celery for crunch. A handful of sharp cheddar, shredded and stirred in until it melted, added richness without overwhelming the tomatoes. But the tomatoes were always the star, their bright acidity cutting through what could have been a heavy, starchy dish. Everything got mixed together in a casserole dish, more tomatoes on top, maybe some breadcrumbs if you want a crunchy crust. Into the oven it went, just long enough for the edges to bubble and brown, for the flavors to meld together into something unified and comforting. What came out wasn't fancy. It wasn't trying to be. It was just pasta and tomatoes and a little cheese, baked until it tasted like more than the sum of its parts. The tomatoes provided moisture and tang. The pasta soaked up all that tomatoey goodness, and the cheese added just enough richness to make it feel indulgent. This was budget cooking at its finest. A box of macaroni cost almost nothing. A can of tomatoes was cheap even in winter. Cheese was the most expensive ingredient, and you didn't need much. For families stretching to make Thanksgiving dinner work, baked macaroni and tomatoes was a way to feed a crowd without breaking the bank. Kids loved it because it tasted familiar, like pasta, but also like pizza, without having to call it either one. Adults appreciated how it filled empty corners of the stomach without weighing you down like the heavier casseroles. And everyone agreed that while it might not be the star of the show, it was a reliable supporting player that never disappointed. These days, macaroni and tomatoes has been completely overshadowed by mac and cheese in all its forms. Gourmet versions with 5 types of cheese and breadcrumb toppings, box versions with orange powder that turns milk into sauce, frozen versions that promise restaurant quality at home. But none of them taste quite like that simple casserole, pasta and tomatoes baked together until they became something greater than themselves. Ratatouille. In the 1970s, something strange happened at American Thanksgiving tables. A few adventurous cooks, inspired by Julia Child and the growing interest in French cuisine, decided to serve ratatouille alongside the turkey and cranberry sauce. And for a brief, wonderful moment, Provence came to the Midwest. Ratatouille wasn't traditional American Thanksgiving food, and it never pretended to be. It was eggplant, zucchini, bell peppers, onions, and tomatoes, all cooked down into a fragrant, herb-scented stew that tasted like summer in southern France. Making it for Thanksgiving was either brilliant or baffling, depending on who you asked. The preparation started with the eggplant, which had to be salted and drained to remove its bitterness. Sliced or cubed, depending on the recipe, salted generously, and left to sit for 30 minutes while it wept brown tears into the colander. Meanwhile, zucchini got sliced, peppers got cut into strips, onions got chopped, and tomatoes, fresh if you could find good ones in November, otherwise canned, got prepared. The cooking happened in stages. Eggplant first, sautéed in olive oil until it was golden and soft. Then zucchini, then peppers, each vegetable getting its moment in the pan before being set aside. Finally, onions and garlic cooked until fragrant, tomatoes added and crushed, and then everything came back together. Herbs went in, basil and thyme, and maybe some bay leaves. The whole thing simmered until the vegetables melted into each other and the flavors became one unified, aromatic dish. Served warm or at room temperature, ratatouille was a revelation among all the heavy casseroles and rich gravies. It was light, bright, healthy, even a palate cleanser that cut through the richness of everything else. And it was different, exotic, a conversation starter that let the cook show off their sophistication and willingness to break with tradition. Most families tried it once, maybe twice, and then went back to their usual lineup. Ratatouille was too foreign, too much of a departure from what Thanksgiving was supposed to taste like. But a few families kept it, made it part of their tradition, a reminder that even holiday meals could evolve and incorporate new ideas. Looking back, serving ratatouille at Thanksgiving was a sign of changing times. America was becoming more cosmopolitan, more willing to experiment with cuisines beyond meat and potatoes. Julia Child had shown that French cooking wasn't just for restaurants, and adventurous home cooks were eager to prove they could do it too. Ratatouille at Thanksgiving might not have lasted, but it represented something important: the willingness to try something new, even on the most traditional day of the year. Baked acorn squash with maple syrup. If there was a side dish that looked like autumn itself, it was baked acorn squash. Dark green on the outside, deep orange on the inside, each half sitting on the plate like a little boat ready to carry you through the meal. This wasn't just food. This was presentation, nature's own serving bowl filled with everything good about fall. The preparation started with the squash itself, hard as a rock and requiring a sharp knife and some genuine arm strength to cut in half. You place on a cutting board, stem up, and drive the knife down through the middle, hoping your hand wouldn't slip and send you to the emergency room before dinner. Once split, the seeds and stringy bits got scooped out, leaving a hollow cavity in each half that was just waiting to be filled. Into each cavity went butter, a generous pat that would melt as the squash baked. Then maple syrup, the real stuff if you had it, not the pancake syrup that was mostly corn syrup with artificial flavoring. Real maple syrup had depth, complexity, a woody sweetness that complemented the squash instead of overwhelming it. Some grandmothers would add a sprinkle of brown sugar for extra sweetness. Others would add a pinch of cinnamon or nutmeg. A few would put a small spoonful of butter and maple syrup mixture in the cavity and save the rest to drizzle over after baking. The squash have sat cut side up in a baking dish with a little water in the bottom to create steam and prevent sticking. Into the oven they went, and for the next hour, they'd slowly transform. The flesh would soften from rock hard to knife tender. The edges would caramelize slightly, and that butter and maple syrup would melt together into a sticky, fragrant glaze that pooled in the bottom of each cavity. When they came out, the squash halves were glistening and golden, steam rising from them, the aroma filling the kitchen with notes of caramel and autumn leaves. Each half went onto a serving plate, one per person usually, sometimes two people sharing one if the squash was large. Eating baked acorn squash was a ritual. You take your spoon and scoop out the soft flesh, making sure to get some of that maple butter glaze with every bite. The flavor was earthy and sweet, the texture somewhere between mashed potatoes and custard. Some people ate the skin, which was edible if the squash was cooked long enough. Others left it behind, scraped clean like they'd been mining for gold. What made this dish special was how it connected the meal to the harvest. These weren't ingredients from a can or a box. This was actual squash, something that had grown in the ground, that looked like what it was, that reminded you Thanksgiving started as a harvest festival. In an era of increasingly processed and packaged foods, baked acorn squash was a return to basics, a reminder of where food came from. Today, whole-baked squash has mostly disappeared from Thanksgiving tables, replaced by butternut squash soups and roasted vegetable medleys. It's easier to cube and roast squash than to bake it whole. Easier to serve from a bowl than to deal with individual portions in their shells. But something was lost in that convenience. The drama of those golden boats arriving at the table, the personal connection of having your own squash half, the simple pleasure of scooping out sweet, maple glazed flesh. That was Thanksgiving in a nutshell, or in this case, in a squash shell. Rice and mushroom casserole. At number 25, we have the dish that promised ease and delivered every time. Rice and mushroom casserole, built entirely on the foundation of convenience foods, represented the height of 1960s and 70s cooking philosophy. Why make things from scratch when Campbell's and Betty Crocker had already done the hard work for you? The recipe was almost embarrassingly simple. Cooked white rice, often left over from another meal, formed the base. A can of cream of mushroom soup, that condensed brick of beige that promised to turn anything into a casserole, got mixed in. If you had fresh mushrooms, you could slice them and add them for texture. If you didn't, the soup had enough mushroom flavor that nobody would notice. Some versions called for a packet of dried onion soup mix, that magical powder that added salt, MSG, and a vague onion flavor to everything. Others just added sautéed onions or left them out entirely. A splash of milk or water thinned the soup, just enough to coat all the rice without turning the whole thing into paste. Everything went into a buttered casserole dish, and here's where you had a choice. You could top it with more cream of mushroom soup straight from the can, creating a double mushroom effect. Or you could go with the crowd favorite, a layer of those crispy fried onions that came in a can, the ones that would later become famous on green bean casserole. Into the oven it went, and 30 minutes later, you had a side dish that looked like you tried, even though the whole thing took 10 minutes to assemble. The rice was creamy and rich, the mushroom flavor was throughout, and that onion topping, if you'd used it, was crispy and salty and impossible to resist. Was it gourmet cooking? Absolutely not. Was it made with fresh, wholesome ingredients? Not even close. But was it reliable, consistent, and guaranteed to please a crowd? Every single time. This was the casserole you made when you had 3 other dishes going, when the kitchen was chaos, when you needed something foolproof. Kids liked it because it was mild and inoffensive. Adults appreciated it because it went with everything and never caused complaints. And grandmothers loved it because they could assemble it the night before, keep it in the refrigerator, and pop it in the oven while the turkey rested. The genius of rice and mushroom casserole was that it never pretended to be more than it was. It wasn't trying to win awards or impress food critics. It was just trying to get food on the table with minimum fuss and maximum reliability. And in that mission, it succeeded spectacularly, year after year, Thanksgiving after Thanksgiving, until convenience foods fell out of favor and people started wanting to know where their ingredients came from and how to pronounce them. From the savory depth of cornbread dressing with giblet gravy to the humble reliability of rice and mushroom casserole, these 25 dishes tell the story of American Thanksgiving across 3 decades. They reflect changing times, from post-war prosperity to the convenience food revolution, from coastal traditions to heartland thrift, from ambitious attempts at continental sophistication to honest, unpretentious comfort food. Some of these dishes disappeared because ingredients became scarce. Pearl onions and chestnuts got harder to find. Fresh oysters became expensive. Others faded because tastes changed. We decided Jell-O salads were too weird, marshmallow toppings were too sweet, and maybe vegetables should taste like vegetables instead of being drowned in cheese sauce. But underneath all these forgotten recipes, there's something worth remembering. These weren't just side dishes. They were expressions of care, tokens of effort, ways of saying I love you through food. Someone stood at a counter peeling pearl onions for an hour. Someone crushed crackers by hand for the perfect topping. Someone risked heartbreak with a spoon bread that might fall before it reached the table. That's what we lost when these dishes disappeared. Not just flavors and textures, but the rituals around them, the family stories, the debates and preferences and traditions that made Thanksgiving more than just a meal. Which of these dishes deserves to come back? Maybe that's the wrong question. Maybe the better question is, which of these dishes remind you of someone you loved? Some Thanksgiving that felt like home? Some moment worth recreating? If this brought back memories of your family's forgotten favorites, share your stories in the comments. And if you're feeling ambitious this Thanksgiving, maybe bring one of these dishes back. Your table might be better for it. Don't forget to subscribe for more nostalgic journeys through America's food history. Thanks for watching.